Hello and good evening. Very warm welcome from me here in the Hertie School in Berlin, and also to those who are joining us online. My name is Annette Riedel. I'm a journalist and moderator, formerly with German National Public Radio, and I'm honored to be guiding you through this very evening. The evening is part of the project of Hertie School and IFA. On a regular scale, they have events like this on the issue of soft power, and then they document it and they publish it. And the same thing will happen tonight. However, it will be a bit delayed because they want to take into consideration the outcome of the presidential elections in the US coming up next week. So you want to check second half of November on the website either of IFA or Hertie School for the publication of this tonight's event. A few words on the course of this evening. We'll start out with keywords from Helmut Anheier in a few minutes, and then we'll have a debate, a discussion on the paper, more or less, with a very distinguished panel that I will introduce to you later. And the main issue being rising nationalisms internationally and also the consequences for external cultural relationships thereof. We'll discuss these findings first on the podium with the panel, and then afterwards you're more than welcome to join in with a few questions that you may have. And then finally, in the end, we get, as a wrap-up, so to speak, final comments by Hagen Schulz-Vorberg, who will then end the evening before we have a reception that I can already invite you to in the name on the behalf of the organizers. All right, having said all that, I'd say without further ado, here come our keywords.
Yes, good evening, and thank you so very much for coming, and also want to thank our friends from IFA for yet another joint event here at the Hertie School. I'm such a child of the latter part of the 20th century that I would never have thought in my life that I would give a talk on the new nationalisms. Right? I did not anticipate it. Certainly not in the 1990s and in the 2000s, that such a movement would rise again. And it bears then, of course, the question, what does it mean for external cultural relations? And that's what I'm going to share with you over the next few minutes. And you see on that slide the structure of my presentation. I will, first of all, make clear to you what the actual challenge is that we're facing. It is a significant possibility of a discontinuity in a long-standing way in which various countries have conducted their cultural relations. This is taken from the website of the Foreign Office here in Berlin. And you know, when you read it, you see that it makes so many references to a common ground, right? To dialogue, to sharing, to creating a mutual understanding, and so on. And in contrast, this is what we have from the AfD in their current summary, a position paper on external cultural policy, right? And it is a very, very different tone, and it goes into a very, very different direction. And this is, however, not limited to Germany, right? That we find that. This is the British Council website, you know, and they're celebrating many, many years, 90 years, right, of shaping a brighter future, so kind of a forward-looking engagement of external cultural relations, and compare that to a statement that appeared yesterday in The Guardian by somebody who's running for the Tory leadership, right? So this is almost a live comment of what we're dealing with, what the challenge is. And So the British Empire brought Christian values. Have you ever thought about that? And did you think about that those who were colonized owe us a lot of gratitude for what has happened in colonialism or during colonial times? So a significant reversal is taking place in the framing, in the narrative of external cultural affairs. So these are our research questions. We wanted to know, how will these new nationalisms shape external cultural policy? And what could be measures Germany can take to shield it from such influences? And I will end on precisely that question later on. But first, I think we have to look at what nationalism actually is. And of course, that fills libraries, right? And there are these 5 characteristics that are essential for nationalism, right? This is not the nation state. This is about a nationalist interpretation of the nation state, right? But the new nationalisms are, while they share these characteristics, give a new twist to the story, right? And that's what you see here. So there is an emphasis on a narrative of victimhood and of injustices that were committed to those who carry a grudge. And they are very opportunistic and kleptocratic even, backward-looking, right? And that's so different from 19th century nationalism, which was a bit of a modernization project of nation building. That's not at all the case here. So it's backward-looking, and it is also something that has been exported. We see almost a nationalist international. They all know each other, so to speak, and they compare notes. So, and they're against the liberal order. When we look at what the current ECP looks like, these are the countries we examined, right? You see major differences, but also similarities. The Western countries are quite similar in their approach, right? There are differences that I will highlight, but there's also similarities. What really stands out are what the autocrats are doing, right? And staying with Germany, it's about liberal values. We have an emphasis on European integration, on creating dialogues, even with those who are different in their political outlook. And we have the phenomenon or the structural element of the arm's length institutions, so independent, largely independent institutions that conduct ECP on behalf of the country, like the Goethe Institute and indeed our friends from IFA, right? And the UK stands out a bit because the UK is the country that has gone furthest of linking economic interest with their external cultural policy. It's almost a nation branding that goes on, and I'll say more about that. Right? A closer look at Germany. So historically, right, the country has a really well-developed external cultural policy, and it's quite well-resourced compared to other countries. It's decentralized. That is one of the main strengths that we've outlined later on in our paper. Right? If you have a decentralized structure with autonomous organizations, they're more difficult to conquer and influence than if you have a centralized system like we have in France. Right? And now we have 2 nationalists, one more nationalist than the other perhaps, but nationalist nonetheless, one more economic nationalism, right? Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, and of course a far-right party in the AfD. And the AfD is, of course, very unhappy with the way Germany conducts its external culture policy and would like to change it. Right? And we think, again, that the decentralized structure of cultural policy in this country generally is actually an advantage, while in everyday life, when times are good, it can be a disadvantage because it brings with it huge coordination costs, right? And German bureaucracies are not good at coordinating. That is something that we all know and that we also teach here at the Hertie School, the lack of coordination. And France, in France we have a government, a nationalist government in waiting, right? And we have a political blockage. And if the Rassemblement National were to come to power, it would likely lead to fundamental and major changes in the way France conducts its external social policy. Right? And in Italy, we have this interesting phenomenon that the major institutions of external culture policy were actually introduced by the fascists, by Mussolini back then. But so far, the party, and of course in the government, Meloni, they have not done very much in terms of external cultural affairs. They're beginning to do that. We saw that in the Frankfurt Book Fair, right? But largely they try to influence domestic matters, in particular the control of the media, right? And I think in the medium term we can expect, should they stay in power for longer, that they will reach out to external cultural matters as well. And you see that many of these right-wing governments share a narrative, right? It's against certain aspects of culture that they do not like. The UK, slightly different story. A very successful external culture policy, has a long tradition, but since the global financial crisis, we had austerity measures, right? And budgets were very tight, and the uncertainty around Brexit. And what is happening now is a opening towards global Britain and campaigns like Great Britain. Right? It's a nation branding, and it is done very systematically. It doesn't have the same resources that we have in Germany, but there is more of a vision around economic benefit when it comes to culture policy. Right? And we now have the soft power framework and forum that brings all the major actors, so the soft power actors and the ministries, together. But in the UK, we don't think it's very likely that you would have Nigel Farage and his Reform Party come to power in the foreseeable future. Right? It's the voting system in the US, in the UK, is simply against that. Right? And like in Germany, we see a danger that some of the elements and some of the content of what is propagated by the right wing will find its way into the political mainstream. Right? And you saw an example of that from the quote that I shared with you a moment ago. The US is, I think, in a bit of a holding pattern at the moment, not only because of the US presidential elections, but because the country is retooling its external culture policy. After the Cold War, there was a feeling, hey, we won, and let's relax, right? So what meant that many of the institutions faced smaller and smaller and smaller budgets, right? And there was almost a withdrawal of American initiatives overseas. And that began to change in the last 10 years. But there is an obsession with China, right? So, and I think depending on who wins the election, I think the concentration of vis-a-vis China will continue. The big difference is going to be to what extent Project 25 will find its way into the presidential and congressional agenda. And Project 25 makes for frightening reading, depending where you stand politically, right? It would, most importantly, downsize some of the institutions that now conduct external culture policy, and it would put under direct government control some of the external media that the United States has. Right? So again, like the Meloni government, there is a right-wing attempt to control the media, because that allows you to control the narrative. Right? I think Gramsci would probably turn himself over in the grave if he were to see how the Italian government is operating at the moment. And here China, a very, very complex story, and a development from a free, peaceful coexistence to a harmonious world to one where China finally, after 100 or something years of humiliation, finds its way as a leading global actor. Right? And in the case of China, external cultural affairs is closely tied to the Belt and Road Initiative and to the Confucius Institutes. Right? So into academia and into infrastructure and development policies, we find wrapped up cultural elements to a great extent. Russia is the most controversial case. Russia directly interferes in other countries. We know about the echo chambers, right? Turkey does that a bit as well, right? And it is quite bellicose in the way it seems to throw its weight around, particularly in the near abroad. Russia has actually lost a lot of its appeal abroad. The indicators that we have show a significant decline in the West, but that's different in other parts of the world. Right? So what we have observed in the case of Russia over the last few years is very likely going to continue. Right? And then we have Turkey, and in Turkey we have a mixed approach. It mixes religion with autocratic, anti-democratic policies and tries to influence the Turkic-speaking communities in that around Turkey and in Central Asia, and it reaches out to the Turkish diaspora in other countries as well. Right? And that is a quick summary. So in China, Russia, and Turkey, we do have nationalist governments in power, and they will continue to carry out a nationalist agenda using external culture policy. In Turkey, we have a religious-dominated one, and in Russia as well. Right? Italy, the government tries to control the institutions, particularly in the media, and shifts the whole activity much more to heritage and displaying national achievements and tradition. If Marine Le Pen comes to power, we will see something similar in France, perhaps more quickly, and with a slightly anti-European element wrapped into it, which we have not seen in the Meloni government so far. And that tells us what does it tell us about Germany and the UK? They are probably the two countries that are safest, so to speak, right? They're not entirely safe, but I think the institutional structure, decentralization and arm's length institutions in the German case, and the voting system and arm's length institutions in the UK sense are a bit of an insurance policy. And in the US, depending on the outcome in about a week's time, we will have a more forceful or a more moderate external culture policy, but nonetheless it is going to be power politics vis-a-vis China. Right? So a closer look at Germany. There is this long-standing emphasis on the pre-political space for dialogue and understanding. That would certainly not survive if the right-wing and the left-wing nationalists in this country gain more influence, unless we think about future-proofing what is going on. And there has been well-funded history and a continuity reaching back to the 1970s, which is a remarkable achievement. Right? So that could happen if the right wing, and I also include the left wing here, nationalists gain more power. So we get the culture wars carrying over into foreign policy. Right? There will be right-wing attacks and there will be left-wing attacks on culture policy for different reasons. Right? And it could lead to a more revisionist view of German history. Right? So instrumentalization of particular population groups is also very, very important here. And that's where internal, domestic and external cultural policy come together. Because if we have many, many minorities and groups from other countries in here that can be used by not so friendly powers abroad to influence events and political debates. And we have numerous examples, right, over the last few years, mostly coming from Russia and also from Turkey. So what can we do? I think we have to be proactive. I said we are somewhat safe in this country for the time being, but we need to future-proof matters. right? We have to avoid what is going on in the United States, where one president manages to undermine key institutions through appointment procedures, for example, right? Think about the Supreme Court. But it's not only the Supreme Court. There are many, many other institutions that suffered. At the beginning, you may not notice it. It's a very slow process of erosion, right? And here are 5 proposals that we think could be usefully explored in our paper. We spell it out in more detail, and I'm sure in the discussion, in the panel discussion, we'll go into more detail. So we have to strengthen the arm's length principle of the key institutions that make up a bulk of German external policy. So that would be the Goethe Institute, Alexander Humboldt Stiftung, DAD, and so on. We have to review, but also the media, right, like Deutschlandfunk. We have to review the constitution. We have to look at the bylaws. We have to look at the framework agreements that exist between those institutions and the government, the rule and the various regulations, and see, are there any weaknesses that could be used, right, any loopholes that could be used and instrumentalized by nationalists. And if there are, by all means, let's change the law. Then we have to improve the coordination between ECP institutions. There should be a collective response. So if the DAD gets attacked by the AfD, right, all should stand up. Right? It's beginning to happen, but it has to be much more forcefully. And you have to enlist civil society institutions as well. There should be a European response as well. I think UNIC should be significantly strengthened. I don't know how you would do that, right? But I'm sure there are ways and means by which we can build both a national and a European defense against nationalism. Third, we need a shield against malign outside interference. It's something that we always underestimate in this country, right? And that interference is going on. I think there should be a plea for some high-level coordination group in Germany. We don't have a National Security Council. That's something that we have advocated for a long time, right? And it's only a conflict between the Chancellery and the Foreign Office who should be in charge of that council. Well, we don't have it. Perhaps when we have a new government in the year, we ultimately get a National Security Council, and that National Security Council should have an element of cultural policy in it. At the European level, perhaps UNIC would be the place to do that, but let's think about ways and means in which we can have a cultural equivalent of PESCO, right? So the permanent coordination among the various armies of the European Union. And then perhaps it is wishful thinking, but I think given the success of Germany's cultural policy over the last 70 plus years, right, we should not be shy to trumpet our achievements. Right? So we make a strong plea for a public relations campaign that it could include all the intermediaries, but it could also include other civil society groups, cultural groups, right? To make clear what we stand for. Right? To come up with a narrative of prosperity and success and democracy and bring that into a cultural message. And I think the European Union would be well advised to do exactly that. Right? For some reason, the European Union is very tame when it comes to getting its narrative across in a modern way. So it doesn't come across as propaganda, but as something that is believable. So we have to have command of the narrative, right? And we can only do that if we create the narratives ourselves and propagate them. And finally, there should be strength through taking advantage of opportunities as they arise, and we should not wait. I think, why don't we have European schools around the world? They exist in some countries, but only for people working for the EU, right? But why don't some countries, a coalition of the willing, why don't they set up a school system where we teach 4 or 5 European languages? But we do that not in Europe, right? We do it abroad. We do it in Africa, we do it in Latin America. And you could think the same of bringing culture as a theme much more closely into existing programs, like Erasmus, right? Horizon Europe. We could open that up, right? And create new opportunities that way. And finally, given that the nationalists always try to get control of the narrative, right? We should work together with the leading press agencies and news agencies of the world. They have just formed what they call a democratic network alliance, right? And wouldn't it make sense for leading cultural institutions to work with that democratic network alliance to help get the narrative across? So we could have made more recommendations, but these 5 seem to be the key ones, and they're all actionable. And I look forward to the panel and to the reaction also from you. But before I leave the podium, I just want to recognize my co-author, Ted Knudsen, who's in the back. Please stand up, Ted. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Lots of food for thought and for debate. And can I have my panelists coming up to the podium, please, as I introduce all of you. Come on up, please. Mike is up here. Yeah, come on up, all of you. There's Gitte Josh from the IFA, the General Secretary. Where you? Yeah, why not? That's a good place. No, I'm sitting here. Thanks. We have Arjun Appadurai. Unfortunately, hi there, not with us. Due to some problems with his schedule, he had to stay away, but we have him with us. We have Elsa Tulmetz. She's a political scientist and a researcher working at the European University Viadrina and also with the French-German Research and Research Training Center, Marc Bloch. And we have, and now it's getting complicated, I hope I make it, Hanna Radziowska. Close enough. She's curator, author, producer, and director of the Polish Pilecki Institute in Berlin. Gitte Josh, from your experience on the ground, so to speak, would you agree with what we've just heard, that the situation in Germany is one of resilience against nationalist influence due to the arm's length approach? Can you agree with this?
Well, I think Professor Anheier showed how different countries' external cultural policies are set up. And so comparatively, the arm's length approach, or institutions like IFA, who we are in association by private law, are in a different situation than countries like France or Italy, where external or international cultural relations are done by ministries themselves, or where the institutes, the national cultural institutes, have a more direct link to ministries. So I agree that this setup that we have in Germany does not allow this direct influence. But I think we need to go into more detail about what this means exactly, because we work in these discourses of our country, and I think they do have an influence.
Can you feel it already? Can you feel the growing influence? Can you give an example?
Yeah, I mean, I think this point about cultural wars and how they spread into into our work. I think this is already something that we feel or see. There's 2 projects that I can bring up. One is the online platform Kantara, which is a 3-language or trilingual platform that is engaging in bringing knowledge or connecting societies from Germany and Europe and the Islam, or the countries and society formed by Islam or influenced by Islam or Arab countries. And this is a project that was formerly done by Deutsche Welle. Now it's done by us, and this has raised the visibility of this platform on several sites. And some are sort of watching the platform and trying to find stances that they can call anti-Semitic, and others are looking at the platform from the opposite angle. And so we feel that there's a bit of just the climate is, people are watching in a different way and trying to find faults. And the other example that we had this year was the biennial in Venice, as IFA were responsible for the production of the German pavilion. And there we also saw that these discourses that we have on the national level, not necessarily shaped by extremism or right-wing parties, but just these discourses that are happening, that they influenced how society, media, institutions, ministries were looking at what is happening there. And so it feels like there's a closer look, and it
You're
makes
being watched, basically.
Yeah, and it makes the institution feel insecure. And there's we're building resilience currently in dealing with these issues, but we don't have this experience, you know.
Elsa Tummelz, in France, it's not entirely unlikely that the next president may be a nationalist, Marine Le Pen from the RN. And her influence, or her party's influence, is palpably growing. Can you already tell on the ground as well that the influence is there, for example, for institutions like the Alliance Française? Or can you put your finger on the influence as it is growing?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Well, so far, while living in Germany or even traveling through several countries, also Eastern Europe, this is not something which is really noticeable, at least for myself, my own observations and experience. However, in France, you notice that some people start changing indeed, or just say more publicly what they think. And this is, for many political scientists, also something that just creates worries, big worries. And I was last week in Toulouse, for example, where I met some colleagues from political scientists, and these worries were quite clear. And if you look also in the south of France, southwest of France, it's a region which is traditionally also still aware of the lessons of World War II, where there was also this part of France was fighting against Vichy regime and so on. So it's, and also, yeah, the lessons of the past, let's say, are still present. And when people start voicing or saying what they think from the right-wing side, and it's really also creating counter voices, which are quite important to hear.
I noticed that of all countries that had been in the presentation, there wasn't a single East European country. And from traveling a lot, as you say, would you notice some sort of a rupture? Is the consensus already at risk about cultural relationship and what they're supposed to be like?
My observation, this is more from the Viadrina this time, from Frankfurt Oder, where I go every week. And it's a French-German, it's a German-Polish university with a French-German program where I coordinate. And so we also think a lot in terms of French, German, Polish, or East European cooperation, also Ukraine now. And what I notice is that lots of people try to put their efforts together and resources together, especially in the field of culture. And this is for me a very interesting movement and dynamic that I observe for the time being. And also this university played a key role. Well, peace was at government in Poland. So you see that the dialogues were there, lots of colleagues were coming. When they needed a voice, they could find a place at the Viadrina where they could express themselves when they were not in the peace move not on the right side, let's say.
Hanna Radziewska, close in, Radziewska. I'm so sorry. I'm going to practice. So I'll get it done.
It's fine.
With the peace government we had in Poland between 2005 and 2007, and then again from 2015 to December 2023, we've had nationalist-oriented governments in Poland. So you saw them coming and going. What is your take on the influence it had, or still has, lasting sustainably so, on the external cultural relations?
So it's, I would say that this personal experience, I will say it in 2-3 sentences, because, well, in 2005 I was still at the university, and, well, I had many experience in many different institutions under Platforma government and peace, in time of peace government. Generally it's this what we call nationalism is of course present, and of course this threat of I mean was present, and of course this I mean fighting for these spaces for dialogue, culture, art, and so on. It's like, I think in every, I mean, it's like 2005, 2007, it's different story, and this last, I would say even first turn of peace and second turn is different. And I would say, in fact, because I mean, I would jump to different story, because this is, if you're asking what's going on in Poland, I would answer, in Poland, I mean, the question if the Western European, they really do recognize properly the threat and danger, what's going on, is the real, I would say, and true worry. I mean, because today when Tusk, Prime Minister Tusk, or Minister of Foreign Affairs, they are saying about recognizing what is really going on, it's we would say there's not new nationalism, for example, in Russia, but it's old nationalism, and moreover, it's imperialism. And the problem of the recognizing what is the reason of these all problems. I would say, you said here, what is the solution for, I mean, proposal how to solve this problem or protect Europe, protect our European values, and you say, let's make stronger, unique. I would say send Taurus to Ukraine, and really most of the problems with these really radical far rights parties in Germany, also influence in Poland, they will stop, because when Ukraine will win the war, I mean, this is the thing which will bring us the true dealing with what is how to protect the democracy. I mean. Because, and this is the last sentence, I think it's the jump to question, soft power, this is very good discussion on problems, how to protect our values in times of peace, democracy, but we are in war. I mean, I can quote Anna Applebaum, you can think that Russia is not in war with Europe, but it is. You can think about that, but it's not true. They treat us as we are, I mean, we Western countries. And this is the problem, that when I'm looking at that, it's these soft power solutions is for different times. Now we have really threat of the totalitarian regimes, Belarus, Russia, China, And I mean, Iran.
Okay, I'd like to bring into our discussion here Arjun Appadurai. Incidentally, I didn't say it earlier, he's one of the leading international socio-cultural anthropologists and professor emeritus from Hertie School and New York University. We're glad to have you, even though only two-dimensionally. From your perspective, from outside looking in, so to speak, what is your take on the European perspective? Do you see what I've asked about earlier, do you see a rupture in the approach within Europe?
Thank you very much. I apologize for the fact that I cannot physically be with you today for all sorts of unexpected reasons, but I'm very happy to contribute something to today. And the first thing I would say is that I can look from the outside if you wish, but I've been living in Wilmersdorf for 8 years, so I have to get a ticket and go somewhere and then look, because I'm also inside, living in Germany today for some time. But it's true that my very long history has to do with the United States, and my personal biography, as well as my academic interest, is with another country that has been not named in this report, but I don't expect it to be, because Helmut's report is 6 or 7 countries out of 190, so everybody cannot come in. But India is where I come from and what I study. So I know Helmut and I have talked a lot about India. It's a very important case because the population of India is now 1.4 billion. It has crossed China. And secondly, democracy is being every minute eroded in India, and that has been true for more than 10 years. So it is also a place where, let us say, nationalism, in this case Hindu nationalism, has more or less captured media, parliament, law, elections, and so on. Now, luckily in India, there is a struggle. So it's not a victory, it's not finished, but it's a very serious case. In any case, I don't want to make the whole discussion about India by any means, but to say outside means for me USA and India, that's how I look at Europe. And quickly, I will say the following. I'm, of course, very closely following the election in a week or less in the USA. I have to say it's very important. So, very important. Why? Because the US is a massive world power. The party that is ruling China, which is the other massive power, or Russia, is not having an election to decide who will be the next head. In the US, which has tremendous power, in 1 week, we could go to a very liberal world, realistic, even ordinary, as someone has said about Kamala Harris, or to a world which I cannot even begin to imagine under Donald Trump. This is a big fork in the road, and it will affect everybody, including Europe. So that is one point to make. And there, of course, the fork, which Helmut Anheier and his co-author's report points out, USA is in this group displaying a particular version of the move to the right, the general move towards an extreme nationalism. And what a quick comment I want to make about this is that there is a very broad tendency for this to happen worldwide. But in the case of the US, a question no one, I repeat, no one can understand is why approximately 30% minimum of the US electorate is immovably in support of Trump, in spite of any evidence of what he does criminally, what he does in terms of his gender politics, what he does in terms of his view of minorities, and what he does with his incredible hatred of immigrants, which makes Marine Le Pen or Meloni or Orban seem like gracious statesmen. That is Trump, and Trump may be the president in 1 week. So I urge us all to think about it. So I'll stop here for the moment only to say, with one comment, that I think on the matter of culture, and soft power, which are connected in Helmut Arnheier's paper with his co-author, that I'm a great believer that culture is a very crucial factor in the world today. And if anything, soft power does not catch its importance. So if you have something to do with information, with images, with opinion, and with knowledge, that has very little to do with arms, taxes, trade, etc. It is all about culture. Now, I agree with one of our colleague from Poland, who said, look, you know, much of the world is at war. That is true, that Ukraine conflict, Israel, Palestine, Iran conflict, they are huge. But I think we cannot lose track of the fact that in many other parts of the world, think of the whole of Africa, think of the whole of Latin America, think of much of Asia, many troubling things are going on, but it's not full-scale war. So therefore, I think the subject of the context of war has to be thought about very carefully, whether it's about Putin or about Zelensky or about Netanyahu or about the leaders of Lebanon, Syria, etc. So I'll conclude by saying that I think there is something bigger than soft power happening, that culture really is about the nature of the way the world is seen in different places, the way information is managed, the way opinion is created, the way the public sphere, the Strukturwandel that Habermas talked about, all those turn on culture. So in the end, I think Helmut Anheier's paper with his colleague is on the right track, that culture is the place where the great global issues of today are going to be solved or resolved or lost and abandoned.
Now, if we agree, thank you very much. If we agree that we all think in the room, or the ones who are following us online here on the podium, that we should be more assertive, maybe even combative about our values when it comes to international cultural relations. It's about dialogue, it's about mutual understanding, it's about facilitating exchange, even when the political sphere is not in best terms, on best terms and in a best shape. If we do agree, now there's one problem here, and I'd like to discuss this with all of you. When autocrats fear the creativity, the unruliness of artists and people working in cultural institutions, they're probably right. Mostly, or more often than not, people who work in the cultural sphere are anti-nationalist. So how can you avoid to have relations with those people without coming across as if you are supporting the opposition and therefore mingling with politics and being reproached for doing the very same thing that we do not like about China or Russia, namely doing propaganda? So how can you tackle this kind of dilemma? Who would like to answer? And then all of you, if you mind.
Thank you. It's a very good question indeed. I've been also reflecting or working a lot on these soft power, hard power issues, also teaching on that in Lille on European foreign policy. I'm always discussing this issue with the students. And it's a very important question that you raised, how not to fall into propaganda when you start working on these soft power aspects. And the answer I found to myself, at least also while discussing with the students, is just let each person express herself or himself as an artist, if you are, or as a person who has a creative way of working. And maybe this diversity will just by itself create the counterbalance elements that we need also as a democratic principle, in fact, to just leave the different ideas or let them grow, and then they should counterbalance themselves and find the harmonic way, a bit like in music. You know, you have sometimes musical parts which are not nice to hear, but others are more harmonic ones. And then maybe the mix of both is what makes the balance in the end.
But it's very difficult, as we would have seen, for example, in Georgia, when the pre-politics sphere, the NGO, the cultural institutions reach out to people who do not agree with the government. Of course, they stand the possibility that they are being forbidden or that they are being reproached for actively supporting the opposition.
I think it's a complex issue, and I'm not sure I agree with the with your thesis in a way, because if you say cultural relations organizations support the opposition, well, then I would say, well, we work with artists and we work with civil society, and that's exactly this pre-political area that showed up in your in the presentation, Helmut. And that's, I think, at the core of what we do. It's not that we're a political actor, you know, and that's, I think, at least from my perspective, with this arm's length approach, that I would then sort of underline that aspect of an arm's length organization. And then that's on a different level that then in Georgia, for instance, I don't know if that happens, then government to government would come into this conversation about what are your cultural relations organizations doing. So I think I see this on two different levels, and that in a way I think is not new. I think that there's always been this discrepancy of values and or of this. What is happening on a political field in autocratic or countries or with those regimes, and what cultural relations organizations are doing. I think there's just now more countries where it becomes an issue, because democracies in number are on decline on a global scale. But working in autocratic regimes has been something that cultural relations organizations have always done, and they were able to navigate and creating safe spaces also for this work to take place.
Let me, maybe the others like to comment as well, Hannah. Let me be the devil's advocate here. We call it image campaign. We call it protecting our own values of liberal democracies. And from the opposite point of view, it is nothing but propaganda. They might claim, well, it's the same thing that we are doing. We're trying to bring across our values, our ideas, and you call it propaganda. And then you turn around and want to do the same thing. It could be a point, no? Who wants to comment?
So perhaps I will a little bit answer to both questions. I think when we see which role plays culture in being in opposition to dictatorship, totalitarianism, let's see three pictures. First, I remember when Navalny was detained and Kretschmar, who was the prime minister of, he is still, of Saxon, he went to Moscow and opened a huge exhibition and he was calling Putin, and they were collaborating together, Dresden and Moscow. And this, I mean, reflection on the cooperation between these deep cultures, I mean, deep Russian culture. It is, I mean, it was like this soft power of Russia that was, I mean, pulling in Westerns and saying, okay, but here we have culture and this space for dialogue and so on. But in the same time, the invasion was you know, ongoing. And the second picture is that many times we say, in our Eastern Europe, I mean, I would say Polish culture, Ukrainian culture, Belarusian culture, Baltic state cultures. I mean, this is completely unknown. And perhaps, because it's very interesting when we talk about nationalism and identity and culture in this meaning that recognizing exactly the past, the history, identity. Perhaps if it would be present enough or on the same level, perhaps then many issues will go in different directions, because the recognizing of the democratic values would be, I don't know, I mean, it will go differently. I mean, I think sometimes that for Westerns, to be cut to the point, this lack of Eastern Europe, and not generally, but particularly with, for example, Ukrainian culture, is the problem of this colonialism, and we need to, I mean, perhaps also decolonize, I mean, decolonize ourselves in this meaning, that recognize subjectivity of these different nations and countries.
Ajul, what's your take on this question?
Yes, I do have some view, and I've listened with great interest to all the reactions to your provocation, which is, you know, my culture is your propaganda, and your culture looks like propaganda to me. It's a very deep problem, and I have an approach on which I have written quite a lot, not answering that question directly, but by inviting a deep rethinking of the idea of culture itself. And my view is directed to my own discipline, anthropology, but really to many others, to economics, to development studies, and so on. And it's very simple. Culture is certainly partly about the past, history, tradition, memory, habit, whatever you like. But it is also about the future. Every society has a vision of the future, whether it's Slovenia, where my wife comes from, which is also part of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and which is not the same as Ukraine or Russia or Poland, but it's part of a wider world, or whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Mexico, whether it's in India. Culture also means, what do people want going forward? And I will say my discipline has failed 100% until very recently, pushed by people like me to say, everybody has a picture of what they want tomorrow, not only yesterday. So, why do I bring this up? If we begin to think habitually about culture from the point of view of the future, we take the ground out from the whole nationalist approach to culture, which is always, it doesn't matter whether it's Trump, Putin, Erdogan, Orban, Modi, the whole lot. It's about the past. We were like this. We were the greatest. We were always this. We were always everybody, good, bad, indifferent. My point is, if we shift the ground to what is your picture of the future, then we create a completely new terrain for dialogue, which is about possibility, probability, anticipation, dreams, visions, plans. It's not about tradition, habit, memory. It's a different platform. And let me say, in this platform, artists have a wonderful role, because art is always imagining something which is not what we see around us today. They're always imagining possibilities. So for me, then, art is a natural ally of making culture a key platform, because we moved away and taken the feet out from under nationalism, which is a past-oriented view of culture. So that's my view.
I'd like to spend a few minutes, maybe the last minutes before we open up the floor for your questions and comments, on the recommendations of Helmut Anheier concerning making our approaches, our cultural and international relationships more resilient. 5 points we've had, and I'd be interested to know more about it. And I'm going to be a little bit provocative once again. One recommendation was improve coordination between institutions of external cultural relations. And I would like to know of all of you, just how far should this go? Do we need some sort of Article 5 procedure? That is to say, one attack on one of the institutions is an attack, like in the NATO doctrine, is an attack of all of our institutions. And what would that mean?
I think it's a great recommendation, and I think pooling of resources, learning from each other is always good. And I think that there isn't enough coordination among German organizations active in cultural relations, that's for sure. And I think we don't need a procedure, we need rooms to meet, and we need the space to exchange for starts on several different levels. And I would like to add a recommendation, and it's learning from each other, and because there are countries that were not in the list that that have experience with new nationalisms on the rise in government, and to learn from cultural organizations, civil society organizations, how they have dealt with this, and also learning what actually were the steps, what happened in Poland, for instance, and how did cultural organizations get or resist this, I think. And institutions can do this. We're going in 2 weeks to Dutch culture in Amsterdam, which is also a member of UNIC, to see what are their strategic issues right now, how are they dealing with their government. And I think this is something that we want to do even more. We do it also with German organizations. But that's, I think, one thing I would add to the recommendations.
So coordination seems to be a little bit of low-hanging fruit. It's still difficult, and there's room for more. But how far should this coordination go? Should it also have an element of solidarity? Let me give you one example. The Frankfurt Book Fair that is just that happened a few weeks ago. The official partner was Italy, and now the Italian government did not include some of the critical authors. They did not invite them, when some of the publishers and the organizers turned around and did invite critical or even less nationalist-oriented authors. So coordinating, learning from each other is one thing, but to be really more combative in a way of supporting those who are acting in word and deeds anti-nationalist, would you say?
So myself, I have a bit different view. In fact, there's also an excellent paper that you presented, Professor Anheier, and with your co-author, and also the discussion here. And myself, I'm French-German, I have Estonian origins. I have some also from my family story issues with Poland. And if you grew up as a person which has already these various pieces of Europe inside yourself, you cannot think in nationalist terms. And I think it's a very good suggestion that you did at the end to have European schools, because they exist already. You have French-German schools. We have just integrated French-German programs. You have so many trilateral programs run already. All kind of also French-German corporations try to open to third countries also to give others this experience. And I think in the cultural field is one of the perfect field to do that, so that's why it's working there. Maybe not in other fields, and maybe it's an idea to open up also to other fields where this is possible. I've been working myself on administrative cooperation, for example, and there the issue of enlargement of the European Union is one issue where you can see it, and it's also what we are trying to do now with Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, so looking at other countries also, ex-Yugoslavia, again, the Western Balkans. So to look at these examples which work and try to see, do not start with the national blueprint, start with what is already existing in a bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral way. That's what we do at the Viadrina with 4 countries already. So it's possible. So that's why maybe it's also a way to think further in the future.
So that means building on existing strength. That has also been a suggestion. Now, how about, and maybe Adrian want to say a few things, and Hannah as well, the suggestion or the recommendation to shield against malign outside interference. Now, this is something that's quite difficult to achieve, given we have Russian example, bots and trolls that actively using, so to speak, sharp power to interfere with targeted countries and their systems. So how to shield against this kind of detrimental influence?
May I respond to that?
Yes, please.
Yes, very quickly. I think I won't speak about that issue because it's very important and very difficult. Who's going to decide what is malign? And if it's coming through the internet, how do you do it without being like China and controlling the internet? Very difficult. But let me go to some other point in the recommendations, which is about the narrative. And I'm very interested in that, which is somehow seizing the narrative so that the anti-democratic right-wing forces worldwide don't dominate the narrative, which today I believe they are increasingly doing. And there I have various things that I have talked about, written about, published on, etc. But let me mention only one. That since we're talking about external cultural policy, I would say one very important thing to do with narratives is to go to the third ideal of the French Enlightenment. Not liberty, not equality, but fraternity. And there is now a whole group of people who are thinking hard in law, in political theory, in activism about what does fraternity mean in the great ideals of the Enlightenment. And I would say what we need to do, and let's be open about it, if we are on the liberal side and do not want to go into the nationalist slide, is to create a dialogue between nations, or if you like, between different cultural policies, which asks the other person, what is your idea of fraternity? Here is mine. That is a rich platform. So I'll leave it with that very concrete idea.
Hannah, I'd like to get your attitude when it comes to the question of creating and communicating anti-nationalist narratives. So how does this go down with countries who've just regained their nationality, so to speak, or are fighting to maintain their nation state? And that, of course, goes hand in hand with a certain nationalism, which doesn't necessarily need to be anti-pluralism or anti-democratic. But, you know, can you think of a narrative that even countries in Eastern Europe could go along with?
I think first of all, it's such a space which is completely unknown still. So when we talk, for example, about role let's take Belarus. Yes, Lukashenko is he detains the people because they stress their, for example, Belarusian identity. Yes, so the more they are, I don't know, these protesters were in this meaning nationalist, they were more persecuted. So this connection and experience of people who are like Masha Kaleshnikova, yes, I mean, many people who are in really Stalinistic prisons and they are dying. I mean, they are because of this Belarusian identity, and this is something which is many times because we look at the surface of these common values, which are also very important, and they are common together. Many times Ukrainians, they stress, for example, LGBT movement, yes, they are in the army, they fight for Ukraine, and they stress it, we are together, and these two things, what we, from, I don't know, Berlin perspective, we recognize as these European values, like, I mean, equality and so on, but it's together with this, what you say, national identity. So I would say that all this recommendation, I find cool, yes? That's fine, but in the end, perhaps what I have in my, somewhere here, very far, this memory that in 2017 or 18, this huge success of German, this external cultural policy, this soft power, I think it was huge success that almost everyone was convinced that Nord Stream was just, economical project. It was not. And the consequences of that, it's like, I like very much the title of one of the books published after full-scale invasion started. Everything is more expensive than Ukrainian lives. And I think we really need to understand that these soft powers recommendations, it's super cool. But if you really know how does it look like war and people who are killed, tortured, and raped because they are Ukrainians, for example, but it's very particular, it's not just general. It's something which really should push us in these dialogues, in these art spaces, in this really reflection with all these European values approach to recognize how to react and really to find out the best solutions, because we can support politicians, we can change in the societies a lot of things. And this is, perhaps I didn't answer on your question.
You did. And I have about a zillion more questions, to be honest, but I'll leave it to you to raise a few that we haven't been able to tackle here. It's just such a complex issue, the whole thing, but I'm sure there will be some questions here. Do we have a microphone? Yes. Then why don't we start right there and then go over there?
Hi. Thank you very much for the talk so far. Joanna Bryson, Hertie School, Professor of Ethics and Technology, which I don't usually say, but I want to bring it up in this context. I really want to go back to something that happened sort of in the middle, that what Hannah was saying, look, something has really changed, related to what she just said too. I'm sorry to use first names, I'm terrible with your last names, all of you. And I'm hard with your first name too. I hope someday we meet in real life. But you also said something about the fact that this power had changed, something had changed. And I think part of what's changed is inequality, right? That in our lifetimes, not since World War I, has there been this scale of inequality, particularly amongst the elite, the OECD. So there's a small number of individuals with huge amounts of power, and that's where this coordination, and you brought up this external influence, is coming from a small number of people that are coordinating. They're opposed to the restrictions we're putting on them with money laundering restrictions, for example, things that they specifically don't want. So So first of all, that's my prognosis about what might have changed. But coming back to the culture aspect of this, what you also saw at the time of World War I was incredible creativity, right? Because then all of a sudden, and I had people say this to me, like, why do you want to change the scale of inequality? Because it's so much easier to go out and find philanthropists and so people can create entire new identities using the culture, using the arts. So I guess I want to ask you, first of all, does this jive with what you were looking for what this changes? And then the thing you were talking about, the synthesis, we do want national syntheses in some sense. We want a new synthesis of identities that lets us keep the borders where they are and reduce the amount of harms that are happening, right? So I guess I'm somewhat agreeing with half of what you said and challenging what some of the other people said. So I don't know if this is a good question. Sorry about that.
Anybody wants to comment?
I would be glad to comment. Thank you very much. I think the issue of change is there already on the agenda since the wall fall in Europe, let's say, or since the end of Cold War. But even afterwards, I mean, we've been going through the 1990s, creating a totally new European foreign and security policy, which was not existing before. So it's like changes all the time since 30 years, I have to say, on the European soil. What myself I see, and maybe it's a question here, I don't know how many people know who is like the European foreign minister, let's say, so high representative for the time being of European foreign policy. I guess not so many among you, but who would have bet that an Estonian could have been like from such a teeny country, like foreign minister, let's say, of Europe, of European Union, like in 2004. I don't think that many people could have bet on that. So that's also what we are going through. We are just also experiencing at some point with this European integration process. And I think if the European Union has been created, or European communities first, on this core value of having peace on European soil. So it's also more or less what binds us together. The question is just, what do we do with nationalism indeed, because they are not pro-European. And I say they because I do not belong to these people, but it's also they are part, maybe we need the shades and lights also to have the lights. So it's, I don't know, just my way of seeing things.
Yeah, maybe we have to consider better how to bring across that forming some sort of union, European Union, isn't about giving up sovereignty, but sharing sovereignty and therefore gaining influence on the international scene. But that's something that isn't so obvious for everybody, I have to say. But we had a question right there. Mm-hmm. And then there and there.
Hello, I'm Eileen. I'm a first-year student at the Master of International Affairs here at Hertie. I want to thank for an amazing panel, and I want to follow up on something Dr. June said. I'm really grateful that he mentioned India and that he brought up the global south, as they call it, because I see one of the big issues with these new nationality as it's as form of to follow up with what Hannah said, it's an identity problem. So people they put up defenses against cultural clashes that they realize through migration, through and they see different views as differing from their own. And I feel like it's a lot about self-interest, which is also something that we're currently dealing with in Europe. I feel like we are looking at, for example, what other countries can give us, or what are they a threat to us, or what can they give us economically, rather than discussing this dialogue that we can have. People are still thinking in very rigid terms of what other countries can do for them, rather than establishing a cultural consensus in that term. And one of the things that I really love about Hertie is that we have, for example, a really big diversity of multicultural students. We have a lot of Indian students, a lot of Latin American students, and it brings in perspectives that you wouldn't normally hear It brings in reflections on your own cultural ideas and your own visions. And one of the things I hear a lot in this presentation is this pro-European or pan-European ideas, and how to expand those. And what I am kind of wondering, which is my question, is how can we balance the need for globalization and a broader view of the world while not triggering this self-interest that is very ingrained in human nature. It's a way of defense. You're trying to protect something that you believe is your own, while still having a liberal discussion about this, if this makes sense.
Yeah, thank you very much for very important input. Maybe Arjun would like to comment, and if some of the others want as well,
just
you're
very
welcome.
briefly, indeed, it's a very important intervention, as well as the earlier ones about inequality and all, but which I also think is a huge, huge question. On the inequality question, I very quickly wanted to say that there are debates about the nature of inequality, where it's located, but nobody disagrees that a small number of people have a huge amount of the world's wealth today. And what that's creating is in my opinion, an aspiration gap. In other words, people want more because they see images of the good life everywhere and they are not there. So the shift to the right has a lot to do with the aspiration gap, not just anger against immigrants and so on and so forth. But on this matter of dialogue, I want to say this, that dialogue indeed should be the goal of any intercultural policy, including cultural policy. But here's the thing about dialogue. We know that it is often used as a cliche, as a sedative, to calm people down and take away their anger and take away their resentment and put them to sleep or make them feel good, etc. This happens all the time. But I do think thinking seriously about dialogue means dialogue has to be on matters which are very risky to talk about. For example, what do you think a minority can contribute to your society? Let's have a dialogue about that. That's a risky dialogue because you have to manage it carefully because people get very angry, very passionate, etc. So my short idea is culture is indeed about dialogue, but dialogue should not be left to those nice soft topics where we can all agree, hug each other, and have a drink and go home. It should be on the most contentious things. So to dialogue, I would add the word debate. Dialogue plus debate equals democracy. But without debate, the whole thing becomes a kind of panacea or sedative.
And
I'll leave it alone.
of course, with mutual respect. That's also a given. Okay, Gitte Tosh.
Just a very short comment, because I understood Helmut's recommendations as directed towards sort of people who are responsible for institutions, for running institutions, and for policymakers. And I think these recommendations are to make sure that we can continue to do the work we do. I mean, we haven't talked about projects that we do or programs that we have. Our programs are global. I mean, the cross-culture program is one of IFA's program where we invite people who work for topics or issues like human rights, cultural rights, LGBTIQ, climate change, in countries where it's not easy to do this work. 40 countries, 100 or more than 100 people who are in this program every year. And we want to continue this. And in order to do this, we need to adapt and become more resilient. And I think that's what it was about. I think we haven't talked about content so much as more about what can we do as organizations.
Thank you very much. I think the next question was here and then there and there. The gentleman over here. Can you raise your arm again? Yeah, there he is.
Thank you very much, Heinrich Kreft. I was in the German Foreign Ministry. I was deputy head of the cultural department sometime in the past, but the last 4 years I held the chair for diplomacy at András University in Budapest. And I would like to stress what the Professor Anheier mentioned, the need for cooperation, for coordination, because the other side is already organized. Just give a small example of Hungary. Hungary is every year organizing the big CPEC meeting in Europe, which was introduced by Steve Bannon sometime in the past. Geert Wilders was there, Marine Le Pen, Meloni, they're all there. And so my question is, can we hurry up, can we speed up to get our act together to counter this alliance which is not in the making but which is already there? And if Trump wins, we all know that we will have a transatlantic alliance with a strong pillar on the European side.
So how to be more combative, basically? Who wants to answer this crucial question? You raised apparently a question that is very difficult to answer. Nobody likes to come in here. Okay, so we just documented. Oh yeah, maybe.
So maybe the key idea is that we have, but I answer again from the European point of view because you ask also in this sense. But we have, I think, also actors in the US which do not support Trump, and in the transatlantic cooperation we have also strong ties that we can rely on. So it's not like there is one country, one political party winning and it's all over. So it's just should be in democracies there and there. So it's also alternative process, so changing processes. So I think there are other actors that maybe can still be supported a few days. Thank you.
So the one thing we can't do is sitting back and complain. So we need
May I make an intervention, just a short comment on this very, very important question. That the other side is highly organized and they're already on their way. What are we doing? I have again said elsewhere, but I will repeat here something that some others are also saying, and it's controversial. I will tell you, this is not something that will make everyone happy. And my statement is this, that the liberal left, using that term loosely, Europe, India, US, has lost the battle in regard to emotion. Feelings, emotion, affect have been handed over 100% to the right. So we have kept only repeating certain things coming out of the world of reason, argument, theory. We need to capture or reclaim some of the space of emotion. And that doesn't mean we have to turn into Donald Trump, but it does mean we better pay attention to what people are feeling and how to narrate some of that. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. I think we have 1.5 more questions, gentlemen here, and then we should maybe get into bilateral thinking.
Good evening, everyone. Nice presentation also. Thank you for your fantastic insights from the panel. I will have one insights and one question. The first thing is, I do not have any problem so far with the nationalism. This nationalism term has a quite glory past that we see when we are talking about anti-colonialism or something like that. But I think Professor Anheier has recommended that to promote anti-nationalism narratives. So I think when we will be doing this anti-nationalism narratives, that can bring up pro-nationalism to defend it for this analysis. My question would be regarding this Europe. He mentioned that this pro-nationalism in Europe is just growing up right now, and it is not even in the power. I'm not talking about the imposed culture in Russia or China, but in the liberal democracy. If it is growing these days, so my question is, who created this vacuum? Is it the failure of this liberal democracy, or how this vacuum is being created in Europe that this nationalism is growing so far?
Ooh, that's enough food for 2 more hours of debate. In a nutshell, who is trying to answer this in a few sentences? Because that's the very question, you know. It's not monocausal, but it's very complex. I don't know. Can we attempt to have an answer? How?
It's what Zelensky had on his T-shirt: "Make Russia small again, and everything will be fine."
No, I'm sorry. That's probably not very satisfying for an answer, but it's the very question that scholars have tried to figure out, and I don't think we will be able to answer the question right now with a few sentences, given that we are going towards the end of this debate. Here's the final short question, if you want. Do we get a mic up here? Here.
Yeah, maybe not so satisfying, but I think I will put one thought. The idea of Europe needs not to eliminate sovereignty, but to maybe share it. Sovereignty, I think, is very interesting, and that implies also, I think, in cultural policy of examining, holding it, taking pride in some ways of its past in cultural legacy, and not rejecting it. So my question is for Mrs. Zukok. You mentioned that in the case of IFA in Germany, there has always been, in some form, collaboration between authoritarian regimes or some kind, and cultural policies, cultural institutes can advance. I think that is a point that raises how is not necessarily connected democracy or more liberal regimes with trying to build a national image or something that is not economical or political, but more cultural specifically. So it's to understand more what you made that point, because in the case of Germany, I can think of many examples. I think the Kulturkampf of the 19th century was a good example of how it has always been a part of some countries to develop their culture as part of a nationalism, even when they are not in war, perhaps even more when they are in peace. So I want to understand more.
I would not put it the way you did it. As a cultural relations organization, so we don't work with a regime, but we work in countries that have regimes, and there we work with civil society actors. So, for instance, some years ago, I was working in Kinshasa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and together, I was in a different organization at the time, but IFA had an exhibition with Wolfgang Tillmans. It's a photographer, and in his works, there's also, it's an LGBTI person, and his works also show this, and I think this is creating a room for this art to happen was something that we did. And maybe that's not a country that you would think of, but that's just an example of what I mean with that. We work with artists, we create spaces for art to exist, we advocate cultural rights, as part of human rights with the work that we do. And we can do this, maybe not in all countries. I think Germany had attempts to work in North Korea as well. That was just a couple of years, because then it was decided that there was not enough freedom or not enough openness to receive this work and create these relationships between civil society or people. But I think it is one of the examples of what I mean when I say we work with artists and we create space for art.
Okay, I think, here we go. Arjun is gone, but I think this aspect we should all keep in mind, that we also need to reach out to people's emotions, because that's something that seems to be very hard. And even in the case of the European Union, I can think of one example when it did become emotional, and that's when the European Parliament had a trailer to make people vote and to motivate them to exercise their right to vote. And that was the first thing I remember that was really emotional. I don't want to go into details of what about grandmothers explaining to their grandchildren the importance of the European Union in a very emotional way. So here we go, emotional, becoming emotional and using emotions. Also, it's probably one very important thing as well. So now we get to the point when one of us has to do the next to impossible thing, wrap up all that has been said within 5 minutes of comments. If one can do it, then it's Hagen Schulz-Vorberg. He can do it.
Well, the hour is late. I'm 10 minutes behind schedule, but maybe the hour is late is already a good metaphor for to start my little intervention. I'm not sure I can sum it all up, and I also don't think that's what's expected of me. When the hour is late, we may feel that we can still patch things up, that we can come up with a new plan, and maybe only 5 points are enough, and then we can get together, hopefully get enough funding in order to finance new great initiatives, and we can patch it up and be happy again, maybe. Or are we waking up indeed to a new gloomy morning already? So is the hour late, or is there a new morning? And we wake up and we think, what the hell has gone wrong? When we were so well-meaning, and when we were expecting things to go better, when they follow a certain liberal order, a liberal democracy, then prosperity will rise, the identities will kind of coordinate, dialogue, cultural dialogue will assist all of this, and a peaceful fundament can be built over the years, making us all kind of able to dialogue in a peaceful way. If I'm not totally wrong, this was a little bit the idea of what cultural policy was about, ever since there's kind of a naive imagination with cultural policy ever since the League of Nations, and documentary movies have been exchanged. Exchange programs of young students have been organized, going to international conferences, meeting each other, believing that if only they talk and exchange, maybe their copy of Goethe and their copy of something else. I don't want to imply that I know every other culture as well. That this will lead to peaceful understanding. Now, all of this has gone somehow wrong somewhere. And I think it's very inducive, or it's very clear that what Helmut points out in his paper, and what this discussion is also about, that when we talk about cultural policy, this peaceful assumption, this kind of peaceful examination of watching movies and reading literature is not what it's about. It's about power, it's about values, taking a stand on values, and it's about using these soft powers in some way. When we read Helmut's paper and we hear this discussion, the actual concept of European cultural or external cultural policy soon blends over into concepts of ideology, of propaganda, of soft power, of something that has political agency inside, something that cultural policy was supposedly maybe not to have. It's something non-political, where we could meet and exchange views, but it has been completely politicized. And I would say we're way beyond the pro-political or proto-political or prima-political. It is political. I guess this is definitely something we need to register, and all of the things that you say here are all about taking a stand. And the question you raised about is this ideology when I just state my values and your propaganda is my culture, that is exactly a crucial point. It's about taking a stand. It very much is, and you need to realize that this is what it's doing. Values are not apolitical. Values are the new politics. They are very much the new politics, and it is something that needs to be turned into policy, into new narratives, and so on and so forth. All of this is totally correct. I think I have a lot to say. I have a lot of comments, and maybe I can expand on this in writing, but I will try to touch upon maybe two more things. here before I come to a rather bleak end. So it's 2.5 things, and maybe then we all need a drink after I've ended on a rather bleak point. One is the nationalism that you describe and that we all witness. Yes, it's a new nationalism. It's in many ways illiberal, but it is also quite smart. It's organized, it has a lot of funding. In its communication strategies, it has completely changed from early days, from the time you described at the beginning, Helmut, the second half of the 20th century, the 1990s. Anybody who was a, let's say, nationalist and had some kind of, they didn't have any idea of public communication, and they just looked weird, and you could laugh at them, and they certainly didn't have any sophisticated visual power. They were not able to undermine the dominant semantics. The new nationalism, the new right-wing populist, they are able to undermine the semantics on which we all agree. They take over these semantics. I think this is very important to notice. That here is a smart agent that is organized and well-funded and communicates with each other. If I take the example of Poland, I haven't been there. I can only read about it at the time. But the Peace Party was mentioned. Yes, it was. We all agreed, or there was a strong emotional reaction. If there is an emotional reaction, Arjun is not here. On our side, it is. Oh my God, how outrageous! So it's an outrage about the crazy things that they say. But they're able to capture a forward-looking emotion. That is extremely crucial. And they also do things much smarter in their sense, if I may say so, because not only have they now a better way of communicating, they also care for certain indicators. When they took over the government, child poverty was higher than when they came out of government. This is something they can brand. So they invest in child poverty, in having children better off, family policies, getting women out of pregnancy and childcare back into the labor market. All of these issues were right up front of what the Polish Peace Party did. And that was also the very first thing that Geert Wilders said when they announced their new government. The first thing was, we have family policy. We care for our children. We care for our society. We are deeply committed to our people. Now, this may be cynical, and there are, of course, other things at the surface, but it's quite smart. And if you follow the OECD indicators, this is also what they're doing. They know the game they're playing. Also the dress code, you see very finely, neatly dressed right-wing extremists. So they know how to play the game in a very, very smart way. And this is even more why the second point that you mentioned, I think, and that Arjun also commented on, is absolutely fundamental. We need to command the narrative, you said, in a very emotional way. We need to command the narrative. Now that is very difficult when you kind of lack a narrative, or when you're working on a narrative. And Arjun said we have an advantage here. I'm not so sure, and I'm merging onto my bleak side of things here, because when I think that I may come across as thinking those populists and Russians and populists are doing a great job. I don't. It's just that we need to recognize that they're smart. They're not just outrageous Donald Trumps who say weird things. They're also quite smart. If we look at how the Russians are constructing the past and the future, for example, the way they are able to mobilize concepts like the Ruski Mir, you mentioned it in your report. Well, that is a very smart thing to do. They create a kind of image of caring for Russians outside their border. They create a community over language and culture, and they somehow also create a building block for justifying a legitimate intervention into another country's territory based on the concepts and the narratives that they produce. And this is not only, unfortunately, and here I disagree with Arjun a little bit, this is not only backward looking. All those right-wing movements are not at all only about nostalgia and the past that they lost, but they somehow are able to link, yes, that nostalgia with exactly also what you said, a notion of victimhood. Something has been taken away from us, and a new future towards which we must strive in order to get back to that absolutely falsely constructed nostalgia. And this is how, as a matter of fact, I would argue, the right-wing extremists have won the future in many ways, in a successful way, more maybe than the liberal leftovers that we are. So that I see very, very, very critically, or with a very sad eye, that there seems to be exactly a lack about a narrative of the future. When it comes to nationalism, in the 19th century, you said it was progressive, forward-looking. It was also, in many ways, imperial, of course, so it was not necessarily a model to follow. If there is a model to follow, if there's something we remember, and that's something that social theorists also talk about, and alas, they're also kind of locked in there, that is the time, of course, of embedded liberalism. A time when we imagined a world that was moving forward, where national identity and nationalism was, at the same time as it was national, international. Creating a national space and a national value system that at the same time serves a higher, a universal, maybe even a global cosmopolitan ideal. Ideas like human dignity, human rights, these ideas were higher levels, and legitimacy was not only within the nation state. Now, much of this is attacked by nationalist movements in order to keep legitimacy inside the national spaces. And at the same time reconstructing a new international space. Again, this is the future of BRICS plus the future of de-dollarization. There is a clear future vision here. And they're also very smart in taking away concepts and undermining them. Russia is talking about diversity. Yes, they are. They're embracing this. We are about diversity. Diversity is Russia. Why? Because if the West wins, then we, as a wonderfully long-established state and culture, will disappear, and everything will just be westernized. So it's in a cynical way, in a cynical twist of concepts. They are out there, and they're very smart. Which leads me, this is part of the bleak end, that, there's a lack of future narrative, and I would be happy to work on it, and we need to work on it if we want to get out of this. From your 5 points, this is my last little bleak ending. You mentioned the language that we need to learn, and languages, invest in languages. I would totally agree with this. Unfortunately, my own department has just closed 6 language bachelors. There's no more China studies, there's no more Russian studies, there's no more Arab and Islam studies, and there's no more Brazilian studies, and there's no more whatever studies, because the languages are too expensive. Languages everywhere in Western universities are closed, they're cut down, and nobody invests in them. So we need to basically work on that too. I'm sorry for the bleak ending, but I don't have much time to work on an optimistic ending so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm glad you brought this aspect of defunding up. We haven't even talked about it, we haven't even touched upon it, but that's also a big, big problem for all of those who work in cultural institutions and work on international relations. Yeah, thank you very much. Very condensed 5 minutes. Thank you very much, the audience, for very concentrated listening. I could tell you were really with us. Thank you very much. And on the behalf of the organizers and in the name of the organizers, you can now share a glass or maybe 2 with us, and we can continue some of the conversations bilaterally. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the evening.